Okay, I think I found the secret incantation to make everything play nicely together.
Brilliant.
So I'm going to show my screen. Can anyone see my screen right now?
Yep, they're fine.
Okay, so thank you for all of your patience this evening. I've had to be very patient myself here. So I'm going to jump straight into this talk. What's this socio-technical architecture stuff? What does any of it mean? Basically means this. Loosely coupled software and loosely coupled teams has been shown by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim to be a key predictor of continuous delivery performance. So organizations which have loosely coupled architecture and teams aligned to the architecture, in their research, were performing much better in terms of software delivery. And there was a correlation with the ability to hire more people in your organization and maintain levels of productivity. I just want to quickly say one thing about this. It is just one example of research. So these findings haven't been conclusively proven. Nevertheless, we've got, something that suggests that there's a correlation between loose coupling in both the software and the teams and organizational performance. We have more data points too. So ThoughtWorks, in their studies, they found that when work leaves a team, so basically when two teams have to collaborate on a single piece of work, it takes an order of magnitude longer to complete that piece of work. And we also have a very well-known person in this space talking about architecture as an enabler of rapid changes. If you want the ability to move quickly as a business, think about your architecture being partitioned in a way that it can easily absorb the changes you want to make. Since we talked about teams and software, we're talking about socio-technical architecture there, both of those. And so if we think about these relationships, these correlations, and why they may exist in the first place, this kind of flow I'm showing here, I think suggests what may be the case. So in an organization, we have teams. Those teams, they're looking for signals from the market. What should we build? What should we focus on? What does the market want? Now, the market is looking for a great customer experience. Very rarely do we get a truly great customer experience, but we still have that hope of one day finding a product that's easy to use and solves all of our needs. Now, a great customer experience is not just a pretty looking web page with some animations and fancy gadgets on there. A great customer experience is enabled by the software architecture, providing the features, capabilities, consistency, performance, scalability to enable that experience. So to close that loop, the architecture is built by the engineering teams. And so we know there's a relationship between the teams and the architecture. What we can also see from this is that the architecture is a model of the domain. So we have a relationship between the software architecture, the teams, and the domain. We need some level of alignment between all of these three things to achieve the loose coupling. Something else that's interesting is the way product management has evolved. And if you look at the surveys in product management over the past few years, what they've started to find is talking to your customers more frequently improve the quality of your products. Who would have believed that? It's completely shocking. Now, we're not talking about just asking your customers, what should we build? What do you want? No, it's taking the feedback and making decisions about what we should build. But that's not the most important thing here. The most important thing I find about this research is the second best source of product ideas. And it's 1% away from being the best, which is team brainstorming, right? If you look at this research, the CEO's ideas didn't even make the top 5. The sales team scraped in at position 4 with 16%. It's actually the people building the product who provide the best ideas for improving that product. And this aligns with what I've been seeing in what people are starting to call now product-led organizations. So companies which take a very strong focus on product, they've moved away from their project mindset, and it's all about building products, continuously iterating them. And thinking about this research, we want to build the product quickly, and we want to have the best ideas for improving the product in the best way. And so you may have heard of these two concepts called dual track agile, or continuous discovery and delivery. And what this is basically saying is there's one team who does the discovery. They talk to the customer, and the same team decides what to build, and they build it. And so this is where thinking more socio-technically is starting to become a competitive advantage. Being able to get the people who build the product to have the ideas by talking to the customer and having them loosely coupled with the software architecture so they can make changes very quickly. So having better ideas and being able to execute on those ideas much more quickly. So that's kind of the background to this talk, the little warm-up. Here's the agenda I put together. Whenever I do virtual meetups and everything works correctly, including microphones, I like to break the talks down into sections. So for the first part of this talk, the next 5 or 10 minutes, we'll talk about dependencies in a socio-technical sense. Then we'll have a quick Q&A, so you can fire your questions into the chat right now, and we'll round them up, batch them up in 5 or 10 minutes. We'll then talk about domain-driven design as a collaborative way to model your domain as the foundation for your architecture and your teams. Remember how a few slides ago we saw that not only is the architecture and the team aligned, but it's based on a model of the domain. And then we'll look at some new concepts relating to organization design, organization dynamics, which have appeared over the past couple of years, which I find very interesting and I've seen working well. And I think in the future, team topologies and dynamic reteaming will be concepts you're going to be seeing a lot more of. So let's talk about dependencies. So we often talk about boundaries when we design systems. How do we break a large system down into smaller components? Where do we put those boundaries? And it is important where we place those boundaries. And it's one of the most fundamental challenges. If we put the wrong things together, our architecture won't be able to absorb the changes we're trying to make, and going around that cycle will take longer. And where you place the boundaries in your architecture, that's where you will have dependencies, where things will become coupled. So I think it's best to go through this with an example. So let's jump into the domain of luxury holidays. We're working for a company, or we're consulting with a company working in this domain, and they've hired a new architect. And the new architect has noticed that many of the teams in this big company have all built their own logic for creating email templates, sending emails, avoiding emails being put on blacklists, choosing between email and SMS, how should we communicate with our customers? And as an architect who's very fond of reducing duplication, he announces to the company, we're going to build a contact service. We're going to do this email stuff in one place, in a centralized place, one service owned by one team. So, is this a good or a bad idea? So we don't know, right? Because it depends on many things. But what does it depend on? That's the important thing here. When we make these choices, when we make changes to the software architecture and the organizational architecture, what are the kind of trade-offs we should be thinking about to make the right decision? So I'm going to give you some examples from a company I worked with that went on this particular journey, and I've seen this one a number of times actually. So in this example, I would say when the organization built a new shared service for emails and SMS and notifications, none of the teams who had to use this new shared service lost anything. They could do everything they could do before. So first criteria is, have we made anything worse? No, we haven't. The second question to ask is, what do we get? What benefits do we get? Do we buy more time? And in this case, yes. Because we've now got 20 to 30 teams and possibly more who aren't wasting their time focusing on emails, they can spend more time focusing on the core parts of their product that differentiates them, their primary responsibilities, let's say. Something else that's important is dependencies. So whenever we talk about dependencies, I often see two extremes. Some people are very, very, very pro dependencies. Like, we should avoid duplicating everything. We should do everything once in a single place. And I talk to other people who are at the other end, the complete other extreme. And what they're saying is, I've been burned so many times in my career by having to depend on other teams. We should avoid dependencies at all costs. In this particular example, because the dependency wasn't slowing teams down, because they weren't asking for changes of the new email contact notification service, the cost of the dependency was low, so it wasn't a problem. And I think in this example, it was fair to say to the company they did make a good choice because they had found bona fide duplication. It was multiple teams doing the same thing, which wasn't core to their primary objectives. And remember, if you have any questions or comments about this, put them in the chat and we'll get to them very shortly. But first, we'll take a quick look at another example here. So after that first project in the luxury holidays company, the architect sees some other teams and they've all got their own package builder. So there's the luxury experiences part of the company. They work in low volume, high margin. So not many customers in comparison to the mass market, but each customer brings in significantly more revenue. You know, these are the kind of people who will spend thousands of pounds a night on champagne, okay? In the mass market, it's different. We have high volume of customers and the margins are low. And the architect says, you've both got a package builder. I see duplication. Therefore, we're going to build a single centralized package builder owned by a new team. And both of these existing teams will now have to use the shared package builder. Have a think about that for 10 seconds and just think about, is this a good or a bad choice? And how would you be looking to evaluate this decision? Okay, I'll talk you through this particular story without giving away any details of the companies involved. So firstly, in this organization, the teams that had to move to the new package builder were losing capabilities, not necessarily things that had already been built, things that they were planning to build in the future. And now, every item in their roadmap, it wasn't a ticket in the Jira board. It was a ticket in someone else's Jira board, which they had to wait for. And of course, when we have this problem, when we have dependencies, when multiple teams depend on another team, and that team becomes a bottleneck, we start to get political battles. And so in this company, I think the perception of duplication was false. And it was a very bad idea to create this shared package builder. And what we can see, and we're going to borrow some terminology from domain-driven design here, is that in the luxury experiences, the package builder was core to them. They wanted to have a very customized workflow where they could showcase a range of luxury possibilities to people looking to spend lots of money on some very top-end holidays. But the mass market holidays, their package builder provided many standard options. It wasn't a source of continuous improvement, and so for them it wasn't a problem. And so effectively what we've done here is we've taken away the luxury experiences, a core part of their domain, and we've made it owned by a team who are now a bottleneck for them making improvements. And some of you are probably thinking, I've seen this so many times, it's unbelievable why companies do this. And some of you might be thinking, wow, how could this possibly happen? This never happens. This happens a lot. Things like, oh, we shouldn't duplicate waste, or we want to have one package builder because we want all of the data in one single place, or political battles. Someone was product manager for a package builder in their previous company. Now they've come to this new company and they need to be owner of all the package builders, all that kind of stuff. So I have a little checklist for you for assessing these kind of dependencies. So as we talked about, will the consumers lose anything? Will they gain things? Will they gain new features they didn't have before to improve their product? Will they gain time to focus on things they care about the most? Will this dependency slow them down? We don't want to be in a situation of dependencies are bad or dependencies are good. We want to be in a situation of, is this dependency problematic? We also need to think about responsiveness. If we depend on some other service or team and we need information from them in order to build new features, to use existing services or problems in production, can we get a response from them? If our service has gone down, people are complaining about us, can we get help to fix things, or will we be left in the dark? Think about the number of consumers, and there's this very difficult trade-off here. If we have one service which is depended on by many other teams, that's an excellent economies of scale right there. One thing is providing value to many other teams. The problem is, if all of those teams need it to change for different reasons, it will quickly become a bottleneck. A very difficult trade-off to make there, because when we make these decisions based on what we know now, but we can't predict the future. We don't know how these things will evolve and what different teams will need. It's a very difficult choice. And now we get to some really interesting things. So, will the cost of migration be excessive? And can people refuse to migrate? So I've seen this a number of times. When it involves you, it's painful. When it doesn't involve you, it's funny. Basically, some teams building a brand new shared service, a new notification service, a new identity service, and the whole company is going to use it. But when they build it, all of the other teams are saying, look, we're so busy trying to reach our commitments, maintain our velocity, reach our quarterly goals. The amount of effort it will take to migrate to the new identity service or the new communication service is too high. We're not going to do it. And the final point here is, trying to ask ourselves, are we really eliminating waste here? Are we making things more efficient? Or are we looking at things that look similar and grouping them together when they shouldn't belong together? So that was part one done. I'm going to look in the chat and hopefully there are some questions. And if there aren't any questions, I'm going to sit here in silence until there are questions. I don't see any questions, but I might be looking in the wrong place.
You are looking in the right place. I'm trying to unmute everyone so that people can just ask a question straight off.
Yeah. The sooner you ask questions, the sooner we can all go. I'm going to be very stubborn about this.
Here we go, Christian.
Well, I find that it makes sense, but it's more the problem getting people to realize it. Also, with all the efficiency we mentioned, I mean, teams has a lot of things they struggle with. First, they need to learn the technology and other stuff. Then they need to know how to make efficient tests and so on. So before it comes to the level where these things kicks in, there's a lot of other problems that needs to be solved before becoming really effective. Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, but that was just my thoughts.
So I kind of agree with you there. I think these 9 criteria I've showed definitely are not an exhaustive list of things you should think about. And actually, I do a 2-day workshop about these topics, and this is one of the activities from my workshops. And one of the focus of the activity is to create a list of pros and cons for both of these scenarios, and also to create fixes. So how can you turn a con into a pro? What would you have to change to make a bad thing into a good thing? And yeah, I see way more than these 9 characteristics. So yeah, I'm definitely not saying there are just 9 things, and technical aspects like having to learn new technologies is definitely one of those things.
Okay, thank you.
There are some questions on the questions panel.
Yeah, it's actually very small on my screen. I'm trying to navigate that right now.
Anthony Harrison has asked, I recognise a lot of the issues, the political battles and the project/product managers wanting control is a big issue. How can this be overcome?
Yeah, so I'm very good at noticing problems. I'm very good at making jokes about problems that happen in organizations. I haven't found an answer to many problems yet. And political battles is one of those things where there are a million strategies, but sometimes you can't do anything. I think to me, my focus is on transparency. So transparency both ways. So as a team, what are we working on and why is it important? But then also top down, like the number one problem I see actually is companies who just aren't clear about their priorities. And you've got a bunch of people all running around, all thinking what they're working on is the number one priority. And of course, when everything's the priority and people have been told you have to achieve your goals, there's no room for flexibility there. And I think at that point, there's very little you can do. Like, I'm sure we've all worked in the company where the CEO comes in every day and he changes his mind about the company's top priority. I really can't give an answer about how you fix a CEO or a leadership that has that mentality. I think if you can talk to them and you can try and give them feedback, some leaders are humble enough to accept good feedback. Well, some of them aren't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horses for courses thing, but one thing I'd like to do is to take them up in a glider. Go for an air experience flight in a glider. Take over the controls. See what actually happens when you move that stick all the way from the left to the right. Bugger all. You have to hold it there for quite a long time, and then eventually the whole thing starts to move. And that sort of amount of hysteresis is typical for big business, and a lot of CEOs don't understand that. Olivia, you've got a question.
Yes, actually, mine is pretty much the same kind of question. Who makes the final decisions? For example, to not migrate or to migrate was one of your examples that you gave. So I think that's the same kind of thing. And what you mentioned is that focus on transparency. While some teams may have hidden agendas and some teams may want to thwart the success of another team, you have that kind of political battle. To what degree does the CEO, I guess, take the rein and finding out exactly what it is about a particular new product. Is it a cost overrun? Is it a piece of new material? Sometimes it's just a little thing, and that gets dressed up in different ways. So anyway,
Yeah.
mine was similar. You know, who makes those final decisions when there's a clash?
Yeah, so who makes those decisions? I think there are two extremes here. On the one extreme, you have some senior technical person or organizational person who says, we are doing this, you have no choice. On the other end, there's no authority. And I prefer the no authority approach, because if you're building this shared service, you have to treat it like a real product. There's a pattern in my experience that when you're building an internal service to be used only inside your company, people think they can take shortcuts and other teams will have to use it. But I think if you treat it like a product and you make this internal service so compelling that people want to use it, that should be the ideal. We don't live in that world, but that's certainly how I think, what the thing I would try to be aimed for, that kind of setup.
That's like
I think
market, isn't it? But internal to an organization.
Yeah, one of the problems I see is companies build internal services, and those internal services are worse than things you can buy off the shelf. You know, and teams can see other companies using these off-the-shelf products, and they're stuck with really poor internal versions, which are slowing them down and costing more money. And these teams are like, hey, we could ditch this internal service and get something off the cloud as a SaaS product and be 10 times more productive for half of the cost. Doesn't make sense.
I've seen it happen. Last question, please, from Connor Dixon. How do we judge when we need to slow down to speed up? When do we need to build these shared services? So that's an interesting question. When we need to slow down to speed up.
Yeah, I think the criteria I gave earlier are about making the decision, but actually deciding when should we think about a shared service. That's more about looking at your IT architecture as a portfolio, looking at the priorities you've got as an organization, and working out where are people spending their time. So if you look at your teams and you see they're all building their own email templating engine, that's probably an obvious sign of something easy to extract into a shared service. In reality, things are much more subtle than this, and it's not always easy to spot what should be a shared service. So I think when we talk about team topologies and domain-driven design, we'll cover some of these heuristics for making those choices.
Thank you. Let's go.
Thank you for your question. By the way, the reason I'm so awkward about questions is I've given a few virtual meetups before, and sometimes you just forget there are people there, and you kind of almost switch off, and you wonder, is anyone listening? So I really I need these questions. Hope you don't mind. So we'll jump on to the next topic, which is domain-driven design. Now, domain-driven design is something people associate with programming, something you do in your code base. Why would we be thinking about DDD as an architectural practice? And why would we be thinking about DDD as something that has any opinion about how we organize our teams? So domain-driven design is a way to design systems. It's been applied in the context of software development, but the principles of domain-driven design and even the practices we use can be applied at an architectural level and even an organizational level. So I'll try and show you some of those things now. So the first one is event storming. So very often, the people building the software don't have a good understanding of what the software actually represents, the business processes, the business concepts, and we rely on translation from domain experts, product people, business stakeholders to explain to the developers what needs to be built. And there are problems with this approach because, one, it's slow, two, it's unreliable. It's normally done by ad hoc conversations or requirements documents. And the bigger the requirements document is, the less people read it. And the shorter it is, the less information you convey. It's proven to be ineffective. And so the problem is, we also miss out on the ability for developers, for programmers to say, I understand the business domain. I understand the requirements you're giving me. Actually, there's a much simpler or a much better way to achieve this goal. And I understand technology. I'm qualified to suggest this opinion. So by closing the gap between the domain experts' knowledge and the software developers' knowledge, we can start to make higher level decisions about alignment, about architecture, about aligning IT strategy and business strategy. And event storming is a technique. It's basically a shared language. It's a shared language for domain experts and software engineers and anyone in the company to create a model of the business, which everyone can understand. And this language is basically orange Post-it notes. So you use orange Post-it notes to model your business processes as a timeline. Now, if you think about that, anyone can understand that. It's not UML, it's not a flowchart, it's not BPMN. All of those tools have very mature and very advanced notation, but there's a learning curve there. Whereas with event storming, it's going the other way. We want a very simple notation, which anyone can understand. And the compromise is we lose some of those advanced features, but that's okay. We just want to have conversations to begin with. Very often, what you'll see in an event storming session is when you get domain experts and software engineers modeling the domain together, you see things like this. So I was working with a fintech company in London in, I think this one was 2017, and we were going through one part of their domain, which we'd event stormed. And I said to the developer, what does that mean? It was some metric. I forgot the full name of it now. And he started explaining it to me, explaining how they calculated it. And the head of marketing, she said, actually, it's not quite that simple. It's calculated a slightly different way. And the developer said, well, I actually wrote the code. I'm pretty sure it works that way. I can get my laptop if you like right now. And then when she realized he was right, she kind of had a bit of a panic moment right there. And she said to the group, this would explain why all of those marketing campaigns aren't working as we expected them to, why the numbers weren't making sense. And you can get many of these insights in just 1 or 2 days of event storming to create the shared knowledge of the domain. So what might event storming look like? So it looks, let's say you were modeling the software or the domain of a conference organizing product. You might have a call for papers opened event. So these orange post-its represent events. We call them domain events. What are the events that happen inside our domain? So the call for papers is opened, the talk proposal is submitted, the call for papers is closed, and the talk is accepted. So if you think about this, anyone can understand this. It's a very simple, it almost looks stupid and pointless. And this example I've given you here is quite pointless because these are very high-level events. In a real event storming session, we will be drilling deep into the details of these events and looking for edge cases and flows. We'll start looking for things like where do customers drop out of the process? What could we do to fix that? Where's the complexity here? What pains are we having? And as people get comfortable, we can add new notation. We can start introducing actors. We can introduce actions the user wants to take. And we can introduce policies, to clarify what are the business rules and calculations here. In fact, with event storming, you can show anything. Once you have that spine, your foundation of domain events, and people have a clear understanding of the business processes, you can add any kind of information you like. You can highlight where we make money, where we could make money, where do our users feel pain in the process, and what can we do about that? We can show external services. And importantly for this talk, once we've modeled our domain in a good level of detail, and I'm talking we've modeled our domain on 10 meters of wall space, and we've spent like 1 or 2 days doing it, we can then start to make sense of this timeline, and we can start to organize things. We can start to group related parts of the domain, not from a very high level, but from a very low level of the details. Once we've done that, we can start designing the communications, the interactions between these. In domain-driven design, we call them bounded contexts. You break up your domain into bounded contexts. So we can then start designing the interactions between our bounded contexts and thinking about, if we design our system this way, what will the coupling be? Versus if we design it another way, what will the coupling be? We can also use tools like the bounded context canvas, which is asking us to go into the details of each bounded context. Can you name this thing? You would be surprised. In fact, you probably wouldn't be surprised, but people say, oh, we've designed our system, we're going to have this bounded context and this bounded context. When I say to them, can you write down the name and a 2-sentence description of it? Everyone suddenly disagrees on what they mean. And suddenly when you write things down, this bounded context does this and this. You think, hang on a minute, this and this. Should those two things be separate? So with this canvas, we're forced to articulate the key elements of our design. How does this bounded context we're choosing, how does it align with the domain? What rules live here? What domain terminology lives here? What are the dependencies between this and other contexts? What we can also do, and this comes back to the question about when do you decide about creating shared services? We can look at our bounded contexts, which are parts of our software architecture, as a portfolio, and we can try and map them out on a chart. So on the y-axis, we have business differentiation. So what we mean here is, how much potential is there in this bounded context to gain an advantage over the competition, do something in the market that they're not doing? On the y-axis, we have complexity. How complex will it be to build or to evolve this thing? When we plot these bounded contexts out, we can then start making choices about what's our priority for the next 6, 12, 24 months. Which things over here on the left are generic, which are very low differentiation potential. Maybe we should outsource these things. If a core team also has some generic responsibilities, we're slowing teams down, working on our highest business differentiation because they're slowed down by generic things. How can we offload that from the team and allow them to focus more on their core? And as a side note, all of these tools I just showed you, they are remote friendly. They're available on GitHub. It's a community effort, and we're in the process of creating them as Miro boards. So if you haven't used Miro, Miro is an online interactive whiteboard. There's a free tier, you can try it for free. And I'm in the process of turning these tools into a template which you can use for free. You can copy them, put them in your own Miro boards, and etc. Another technique I find useful is example mapping. This is where you take an event on your EVENTSTORM and you say, what are all of the other possible events that could happen here? And this technique is just so amazing because you uncover things. When you ask a group of people to focus on one event and their mind is totally focused on one event, they can find 10 or 20 edge cases you never thought of before. And that helps you to uncover opportunities or problems that you haven't thought about. So that's one of my favorite techniques. So this brings us to our second pit stop. Do we have any questions this time? So a CFP is a call for papers. So when a conference wants to invite speakers, you can apply with a call for papers.
You called them proposals in the example, so that may be confusing. So in the slides, it was called a proposal rather than a paper.
Sorry, yeah.
The CFP.
Yeah.
We have some questions left over from before.
Okay. I'm going to work up from the bottom here, okay. And actually, I'll let you take the questions, if that's okay. You can read out the questions to me.
I'll read them out.
That's okay.
So
cool.
From the bottom, then Ian Jones is more of a comment than a question. He was talking about this battling over what gets done. He recognised this from a pension admin system. My old firm had multiple ones that did similar jobs, but the effort of migrating off the old ones was too high, and due to mergers, the list of systems only grew over time. A support nightmare. So,
yeah, and this is why I'm a fan of this kind of tool, because you can show to the company, you can put your bounded context or your microservices on here, and you can actually overlay the number of people working on each of those bounded contexts. And you can highlight, we've got a bunch of people working on this old system, which means they can't be working on our core. If you spend 6 months reducing the complexity of this system over here in the generic supporting space, and we reduce the complexity, we can take people off that and put them on something else. So whether you use this tool or something else, I think it's important to be able to visualize these choices you're making, and to give some sense of, to be able to quantify them in some way, make it more strategic. Because what happens is people just go on their gut feel, oh, it's too complex to migrate away from this, we have to keep using it. If you can visualize that in a compelling way, and you can show them, actually, it is complex, but this is the trade-off you're making. By not fixing this in the next 6 months, we're going to be slow for the next 2 years.
Great. Michael Wildman has asked, what if something is a good candidate for centralization, such as IAM, Identity and Access Management, but teams are too busy and stubborn to migrate?
Yeah, I see this one all the time. I was alluded to this earlier. I think, again, we go back to the portfolio. We need to be looking at these decisions we're making as part of a portfolio. If we refuse to move to a centralized identity service in the company, what are we giving away from that, both in the short and the long term? If you can visualize these trade-offs and make people realize the actual choices they're making, it's always easier to go with the status quo to not do something. If you can actually visualize to people the cost of not doing this is actually greater than doing it, that's when you can start to convince them. It's not easy, but I find visualization helps. Trying to bring this strategic view, looking at things as a portfolio over the next 6 months to 2 years.
Thank you. And last but not least, Tom Gilb, who is well known for both agile and value-based approaches, asks, how do you define value? And do you quantify and measure any of the customer factors that were mentioned in part 1?
Yeah, so that's super interesting. So on these charts I have, we have differentiation on the bottom and complexity on the left. Actually, how you measure those things is actually very complex in itself, and we have no reliable way really of measuring either of those things in an extremely accurate way. I think where we can get data, so where we've done user research, we've got feedback, that's obviously data points we can feed into this. And then I think it's about being able to visualize what we think the value is versus the complexity, and making decisions as a group. So I think show people the data, visualize the choices somehow, and then as a group we try and reach consensus. I think that's as good as I can offer, really. In terms of which data points would you use, I think on the value side, we can obviously measure lots of things about how people use our products. That's always a good one. We can get qualitative feedback from surveys, looking at market research. It's not my area of specialization. I don't have like an extensive list of metrics I'd use there.
It sounds to me, Tom, as if the two of you might like to get together and discuss that in more detail, because you've probably got something to contribute there. I've unmuted your microphone, Tom. You've got another question about research. Would you like to pose it directly?
Is my microphone on now?
Yes.
Okay. Nick, you cited a number of methods that you like and have good experience with. And my question is, can you cite any research, however formal or informal, showing the productivity which you're implying from the use of these techniques compared to any other similar techniques?
No, I don't think so. I don't think anyone's done research with event storming yet. No, I don't think there's any research. I think there's not really that much research for any of the techniques I'm aware of, to be honest.
Okay, we'll leave it at that, and maybe Google it and see what happens later.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean,
question. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I think we would all like to have some research showing if these techniques work or not. From my experience, I'm just doing what I've seen and I think works. I'm going to be clear here. Like, I'm not saying these will guarantee to make things better for you. Like, from the evidence I have available, these techniques are useful. That's my perspective here.
Okay, that's an honest answer. Thank you very much.
And the last question in this section is from Krishna Kumar Paramazivam, if I've done that right. He says, can you share an example, if possible a recent one, where you've used this design model and shown its benefits?
So I'm assuming you mean this process of using domain-driven design to create architecture and teams. I don't think I have a public example of it, but there are some papers out there of other people who've done this. So my friend Casper Gunya, he is publishing an experience report this week with the Agile Alliance, I believe. He talks about his experience building a reward service with I really need to not say the company name here. With, you can read the paper and you'll be able to kind of get an idea of what company it is. So his name's Casper Gunya, G-U-N-I-A. I'll post it in the chat at the end of this talk if I remember. Another person who's wrote about this is Kenny Baas. So he works with consultancy in the Netherlands. He talks about going through this process as a way to identify teams and architecture. So we don't have any hard numbers saying these things work, but we do have some experience reports, that's for sure.
Thanks. I'll mute myself now and keep it on.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. We'll move on to the last section of the talk now, and we'll have some more questions later if anyone has them. So one of those things that's popped up over the past few years and been, let's say, very contentious is the Spotify model. The Spotify model is organizing your teams into squads, tribes, guilds, and there's another one, I always forget one of them. Squads, tribes, guilds. Yeah. Basically, this was an off-the-shelf model for organizing your teams. and loads of companies rushed out to adopt the Spotify model because there were some great compelling talks about the Spotify model. And I think probably most of those companies have run into problems because it's a very high level superficial model, and the people at Spotify said, actually, we don't even do that here anyway. A couple of teams tried it a few years ago, no one does it anymore. And so as Matthew Skelton says, the model is, it talks about a few aspects of organizing your teams, and there are many things it doesn't talk about. So he and his colleague, Manuel Pei, they wrote a whole book about all of those things the Spotify model doesn't cover. So their book is called Team Topologies, and their tagline is organizing your technology teams and software architecture for fast flow. There's a lot of theory in their book. They do cite a lot of research, a lot of academic references in that book. And one of the key contributions or introductions in the book is their 4 team types. So they say that in your organization, every team is one of these 4 types. A stream-aligned team is a team who's delivering user-facing value, typically. They're working on a part of the domain, which produces something of external value, let's say. It contributes to your products. An enabling team is a team inside your company which helps other teams but doesn't own any deliverables. An enabling team has a couple of characteristics. The most interesting one is an enabling team should have a goal and an expiry date. I'll let you read the book to see what that means. Complicated subsystem team it's a shared service in your organization. And the reason for creating this shared service is because it requires a higher level of domain expertise, which is not widely available in the company. So we have to group these concepts and create a team based on the knowledge they have. And then we have platform teams. Platform teams build those generic kind of services which enable other teams to build and run their services. Things like an application deployment pipeline, and maybe some internal services like an ID system and single sign-on, maybe even a notification service might live in here. What Team Topologies doesn't talk about, though, is how you would find those boundaries. And that's where the relationship with domain-driven design comes in here. So you would start with DDD to understand your domain, identify possible boundaries, and then use Team Topologies concepts to start looking for those boundaries. One of the interesting things I like about this book is they've been able to clarify something that's I've always felt but never been able to explain, which is when you build a platform, the goal of the platform is reducing the cognitive load of the teams in your company so they can focus on what really matters to them. I have to be careful here not to name any companies, but there are companies out there who I've worked with, and their platform is so complex that developers in the company spend half of their time fighting the platform and not being able to do work. In Team Topologies, they talk about developer experience, building your platform as a product and treating the developers in your company as your user and making their life as simple and easy as possible. And another problem they talk about is platforms don't have to be huge things. Platforms can be very small, thin platforms. They call thinnest viable platform. Another concept they talk about is interaction patterns, and they've introduced a model here too. So they talk about 3 kinds of interaction between teams. So 2 teams can be interacting in the collaboration mode. This is where there's a reasonable degree of dependency between the work they're doing, and it requires the teams to interact on a fairly frequent basis, having meetings on a frequent basis, let's say, where frequent is undefined, but it's more than nothing and less than always. X as a service, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's where one team depends on another but there's very little collaboration. Like, this is a service you can use, it has documentation. You don't need to talk to the team that owns it a great deal to be able to use it. And then there's facilitating, where one team is helping another. They're helping another team to hit their goals. So they're not collaborating on mutual goals. One team is helping another to achieve one team's goals. And actually, one of the great things about this book is they talk about these patterns are a snapshot in time. And thinking about how these patterns between teams can evolve over time and why they evolve gives us lots of insights about how our architecture, how our product is evolving and why, and bringing that strategy and that portfolio thinking into the work we're doing. So a team can go from collaborating to X as a service. Why might this happen? This might happen because when you're building something new, the boundaries are unclear. The responsibilities are unclear. Having teams collaborating to build these first versions of the product makes sense. And when you start to identify stable boundaries, requirements that neatly partition, then you switch to the X as a service. So both teams can work more independently. Lower collaboration means they can deliver more work. And then another variation is we could go back to facilitate. We could go to facilitating here. So they were collaborating, they switched to X as a service, and then one team suddenly has a bunch of work in their backlog. Those two teams can work together, but this time one team is helping the other to achieve their goals. We can also go from facilitating to nothing. So when some teams are working together, that shouldn't be a permanent thing. It should be based on what we're working on now and the goals we have. And equally, we can go from X as a service back to collaborating. We thought we had stable boundaries. We thought responsibilities were clear. But the way the product is evolving, the way the domain's evolving, now we need to rethink the boundaries in this particular area and between those teams. So the key point here is that being deliberate about how teams collaborate is important, because working closely means we stay highly aligned and we go in the same direction together. But the trade-off is we get less work done. If teams are collaborating less frequently, they can get more work done, but there's more risk they're going in the wrong direction. So these patterns are encouraging us to think about what's the right type of collaboration between two particular teams in the particular moment and potentially in the future. They talk in the book about some triggers for when these boundaries might change or interaction modes might change. So software's too big for one team. You've got a team of 5 or 6 developers. They've got so much work in their backlog. They're being pulled in 5 different directions. Probably need to split things up there. If the amount of work they're delivering gets slower, that indicates either the system's getting more complex or they're context switching a lot. That's another sign. And if one team depends on many others, and that's becoming a bottleneck issue, maybe the boundaries need to be rethought in that area. And so what you can do is you can take those DDD core domain concepts and you can actually apply the team topologies on top of that. So you can actually represent your socio-technical architecture in this way. You can say we have these bounded contexts. You can call them microservices, business capabilities if you want to. You can visualize how important they are to you and how complex they are. And you can show how this will change over time. So up here we have a core domain, but we can see that in 2 to 4 years, it will be a supporting domain. We expect the competition will be able to catch up with us in this area. So we need to be thinking about what's our new core domain 2 to 4 years from now. We can also see team sizes here. We've got 8 people working on the core domain, 5 people and 2 people in these generic services. So basically we've got almost half of the people on generic stuff, which has no differentiation potential, and the other half on our super core stuff. Is there a possibility that we can actually reduce the number of people in the generic space and move them to the core? So that was a quick intro to team topologies. I would recommend reading the whole book. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And the team topologies guys, they've also got some tools on GitHub. They've got the independent service heuristics checklist, team dependency tracking, definitely worth taking a look. So the final topic I'd like to talk about is dynamic reteaming, which can be very controversial. And if we think about the way things have changed over time, in terms of teams, kind of makes sense. You know, in the previous generations of software development, we had a project mindset. We put the business case together, we build a team, define the scope, deliver the scope, project's over, team moves on to something else. And then those agile people came along and said, do you know what, this kind of doesn't work because software services are always alive. They always need to be constantly improved. We need to have these static teams. We have one service owned by one team and that team will always stay together. But that can also be problematic because people get comfortable, people get used to working on a service. And what if that service doesn't have any strategic value to the company anymore? What if we want to put less people on that service? What if we need some fluidity in the organization? We just don't have that potential anymore. So Heidi Helfand wrote the Dynamic Reteaming book, and she talks about actually there's a lot of benefit to rotating people between teams. These two extremes of the project mindset and the static agile mindset, neither of those extremes is where we want to be. We want to be having a long-term focus on our products and having teams which continually evolve the products. But we need some flexibility. We want to benefit from mixing people's ideas and seeing what happens. And she puts together quite a compelling, I would say, a compelling array of reasons why you should restructure your teams on a frequent basis. When the company grows, when the shape of the work coming in doesn't match the shape of your teams. If 80% of your work is being spread across 20% of your teams, they're a bottleneck. Sometimes you have code bases which are tightly coupled and you need people to stay focused on that, even though that's not your ideal organizational boundaries, or the code is too coupled and you need to reshape your code boundaries and reshape your team boundaries. And she also takes a more humane aspect. Sometimes people need a fresh start. Sometimes people just don't get on well working together. Sometimes people have hit a brick wall in the team they're working in and a way out is needed. And so she talks about all of these reasons in the book. And she also presents a collection of patterns. So one example is the nomad pattern. So when a new person joins the company, they spend time in many different teams in your company before they finally settle in a single team. Obviously, the benefit here is trying to avoid that silo mentality, having an understanding of who the other teams in the company are, the way they work, their personalities. That can pay dividends in the future when those people need to collaborate, or those people can share ideas and create new insights. She talks about the one-by-one pattern. So it's very often for companies, they'll get a huge amount of funding or they'll decide to invest in a new product and they'll try and scale the organization with tens or hundreds of people in a very short amount of time. But making those radical changes can have a big impact on your company. And if you've worked in a company and you've built a culture which is working for you, which is a good company culture, too many changes in a short period of time can really dramatically change that. I've seen this one a few times. She talks about the mitosis pattern, so breaking things in half when they get too big. She talks about things like if your stand-ups are long and boring, maybe you've got too many people there, or maybe your stand-ups just suck, which is also quite common. She talks about micro teams, and this is something I've seen, I'd say I've seen this not a lot, but it's becoming more frequent over the past couple of years, where we have a number of small teams of say 4 people, in each team, and they are constantly rotating. So it might be that one person rotates between each team once a month. And the benefit of this model is people get to work with different people, keep it fresh, share ideas. But also, if the shape of the work changes, if a high volume of work is concentrated in one team, it's very easy to put more people in that team because they've worked there before. When you join a new team, there's a high level of overhead. What's the process? Learning the code base, getting to know how the team interacts with each other. If you've worked in that team before, you can hit the ground running. So you've got some fluidity there as an organization. But there are many pitfalls here. People form relationships and enjoy working together. They enjoy a sense of continuity. So there's a business aspect here, what's best for the business, but there's also a humane aspect, like what's best for the people. And I think you need to consider both aspects when we talk about micro teams and team fluidity. She also talks about patterns for innovation, building new products, trying new ideas. So I think we've all seen this pattern, but she just gives names to things. The isolated innovation pattern, where we just form a new team from existing people and allow them to build something brand new, decoupled from all the politics and bureaucracy. And here's some reasons for more socially driven reasons for teaming. Someone wants to move on to a different product, to learn some new technologies. Someone's not happy in their team. Someone's thinking of leaving the company. Moving to another team can help prevent that. And I think one of the more radical ideas, in what's quite a radical book already, one of the more radical ideas is that turning the decision-making process upside down, rather than managers deciding the team structure, teams themselves should decide what they work on and who they work with. And actually, there's a company in the UK called Redgate Software. They published a blog post towards the end of last year, and they did this at their company. I think it was the second time they'd done it, or the third time, where they basically allowed people to decide what team they wanted to work on. They had a whole big festival kind of event going on in their company. Heidi calls it the team choice marketplace in her book. I think Redgate called it that too. Whether you agree or disagree, I think it's worth taking a look. She also talks about anti-patterns. We all like anti-patterns, right? You know, we all like looking at what's good, but we all like enjoying seeing what's all the bad things that can happen. So see if you've seen any of these anti-patterns in the companies you've worked with. The percentage anti-pattern, where one person spends 20% of their time in one team, 40% of their time in another team, and various percentages of their time in another team. And what really happens is this person is just context switching all the time. Spreading high performance anti-pattern. I once worked at a company where I was a principal engineer, and there was another principal engineer, and we really wanted to work together. But because we were principal engineers, we weren't allowed to work together. This stuff really does happen. Sometimes there are good reasons for it, but having a strict rule, you can't work with another principal engineer, is quite a bad idea. And there's also the golden handcuffs pattern. Who's been in this situation before? Who's in this situation right now, where you want to leave a company, or you know someone who hates working at the company? They're grumpy, they're annoying, they put no effort into their work, and there's just no reason for them to be in the company. But because they're getting paid so much, they can't leave or they won't leave. Yeah, the golden handcuffs anti-pattern. We've all seen this, and now we've got a name for it. So that was basically the talk. I've got a few slides to wrap things up. In fact, 2 slides. The first one is, here are the 3 main books which have been referenced in this talk. 3 books which I think are very useful. Being honest, you know, there isn't a huge amount of research confirming that all of these things will make you successful. So look at the experience reports, try them out in small low risk environments, and see for yourself if you think it can be useful for you. Team topologies and dynamic reteaming, they do talk about some research. Their ideas are based on research, but these techniques themselves haven't been studied and researched yet. In fact, most of these concepts are fairly new. So I'm now available for any questions if you have any, and there are no more slides.
Well, the first question that probably comes inevitably at the end of one of these sessions is, can we have a copy of your slides, please? So I'd be kind of...
Yeah, sure. I'll put slides on my website, sure.
Okay, if you've got them on your website, I'll just publish a link. Thank you. And we'll also, in a few days, we should have this recording of today's session on the BCS YouTube channel, on which there's a BCS SPA playlist.
Sounds good. If you can cut the first 40 minutes of me faffing around with technology, that would be really appreciated.
Of course. Yeah, we started the session more than half an hour early, so yes, I'll definitely edit that out. There's a question here from Christian Johansson. It says, can you tell about examples of successful team transformation in your consulting work?
Successful team transformations, yeah. I'm actually working with a team now who've made some big progress. Again, I've got to be very careful not to name specific companies or people, but let's say some of the problems were lots of unhappy customers, let's say, unhappy users, unhappy stakeholders. So from the user's perspective, the work was very slow to deliver. It was they had to ask 2 to 3 months in advance, can you build this feature? So there's a long lead time on the work. The project management team were unhappy because at the end of every sprint, there were lots of bugs, and sometimes the deploys weren't happening, so no work was getting delivered. And the team weren't happy because they were being blamed for lots of things and not delivering work when the requirements were ambiguous. The platform they were working on was always on fire, so they couldn't get work done when they wanted to. Everything was on fire here, basically. So the team, this one particular team in the company, started having retrospectives every week. One retrospective every week. The team decided we can't just continue on this way. So we want to improve things. Let's make improvement. Let's not just talk about improving, about nice to have. Let's actually spend 1 hour every week having retrospective and thinking about what we can improve. Then they started using techniques like event storming to map out their current process and to start thinking about how to improve their process. And the changes they made were getting the developers involved in the requirements gathering. So before anyone starts work on things, the developers have seen it. They've got clear acceptance criteria. So when the developers start on a piece of work, there's very little that's unclear anymore. And the results were positive. So taking more time up front to be clear about what needs to be done, spending more time on improvement, making improvement not just something you talk about, but are you spending an hour a week on improving, that kind of stuff.
Alec here. Quick question. Do you see any of these ideas in use beyond the sphere of software development?
I don't really get outside the sphere of software development. I'm really a geek about those things. I'd like to though, but yeah, I'm boring.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Going back to the team transformation, talking on a higher level, I have seen the micro teams pattern over the past few years. So one company, basically, they decided that they wanted to optimize for consistency. They had a clear roadmap. They wanted to get the work done as quickly as possible at a predictable pace. They wanted the business to see progress. So they moved to the micro teams, and they had one person rotating from each team once a month. And that way, they had the flexibility to move people around, but also they were able to leverage bringing in contractors more, and the contractors also rotated. So because everybody has worked on everything, when you lose one person, you're not losing a huge chunk of knowledge, which only one person has. You're spreading the knowledge between multiple people. Any more questions?
Well, there was one that I've just sent to you via the chat. What are the factors to decide the longevity of long-lived product teams? Is it for the life cycle of the product? And if so, how do we manage resourcing challenges for multiple product offerings requiring cross-functional teams?
Let me have a quick think about this one. So in terms of the longevity of a team, that's where we need to be thinking about a portfolio level. So first of all, what's the company strategy? What's the product strategy? I think the choices we're making should all be working backwards from there. Like, where does the company want to get to? That should be the first starting point. And then thinking about what's the architecture we need to get there, and how do we need to organize our teams to deliver that architecture and be able to evolve the architecture in the way we expect things to evolve in the future. We then have to work forwards, which is, well, we have the existing team structure, and we have the existing architecture, the existing code base with its technical debts. Things are coupled, hard to change. And we need to find a choice in the middle about what changes do we make now based on where we'd like to get to and the constraints we currently have. So again, I think starting from the product strategy, thinking about your IT architecture as a portfolio and building your strategy from there. I think there was a second part to this.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm not fully capturing the second part about multiple product offerings. So I think there are two scenarios come to my mind here. One is where we have one product and there are multiple teams building services which contribute to that product. This is where we need to start thinking at a higher level. In the Spotify model, they would call these tribes, groups of teams that work together. Thinking at that level. And also sometimes we work in a company where there are lots of small products and they're all equally valuable. And sometimes one is more important than the other, and it can change over time. And that again that's where this agile, fixed, long-lived teams doesn't really work, because we have more services than teams. So there's a few ways of approaching this problem. I think from team topologies, they would tell you, think about cognitive load. So what's the maximum number of services a team can possibly own without having so much cognitive load they can't be productive? I think that will be a good starting point. If that doesn't answer your question, I'm very happy to follow up on that if you want to. Or you can come on and speak if that's possible, and we can discuss it.
Yeah, everybody's got the freedom to unmute themselves and ask questions. I was going to invite Vinat Shagisudanov to talk to us next. Vinat, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So Nick, question is that we've been most of the techniques that we've been discussing and looking at, they're applied to the companies who actually have any core businesses, so to speak. The work in a specific domain spaces, the product, they're either product or project-based companies. How would you apply the approach that combines, let's say, DDD, architecture, team topologies, and team dynamic reteaming, but towards the professional services companies and technology consulting companies? Because typically these guys are perceived as to be like chameleons and adhering to the rules and desires of the customers, but they also subject to their own efficacy and efficiencies of their own internal organization processes. So they highly influenced by the external world, but in the meantime, they need to develop and organize themselves around their own competencies and strengths and potentially domains as well in which they're operating. So have you thought about, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts around applying the socio-technical aspects, but towards the professional services companies and how it can help them? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to spend some time working in that space, but I don't really have much expertise there. So I know Zebbia in the Netherlands, they organize their consultants. I think they call them pods. So they have a group of consultants who work together on projects in a specific area. But I don't really know how you would apply these concepts to the company itself. I guess as a company, anything you do, there is a benefit and a cost. So if you can map out your options and you can find a way to measure the costs and the benefits, and you can start to have those discussions about what's the strategy, I guess from a general perspective, that would make sense. But I don't think I can be very useful, unfortunately, although I'm very interested in that particular domain. I would be keen to learn more about that. I don't have a great answer right now. It's not my area.
Thanks.
Thank you.
A couple more questions, and then we're sort of coming towards 8 o'clock, so we'll have to end it at some point. Benoit Pasquerot, you have a question? Benoit says, how do you choose the persons who rotate in the case of team rotations?
I think there are different ways of doing this. So one is you as a person, you rotate once every 3 months or 4 months. So it's equally shared. Typically with the micro teams pattern, there's always one person who stays in the team on a longer period, like a team lead or a tech lead. Because typically people outside the team, they want a point of contact they know they can build a relationship with, who to them is the face of that team. If you're always rotating their point of contact, you can lose some of those connections that form in the company. Sometimes people don't want to rotate, so they don't have to rotate. So yeah, a variety of strategies. I think it's important that if you want to do the rotation, you can't just force it on people. What you can do is you can say, we've made a decision that every person is going to rotate once every 3 or 4 months. Anyone joining the team has to be comfortable with that, as long as you're clear up front about that. Other different patterns. So when I've done a lot of rotation, especially when I was a junior developer, I enjoyed spending 1 or 2 weeks with another team. I got to work with all of the senior engineers in the company, pair programming with them, going for lunch with them to learn about stuff. So you can also do a more short-term rotation. And again, some people love it like me and some people don't.
Yeah, so you'd say basically it's up to the individual to some extent, isn't it? That self-organizing teams is a big thing in Agile, and I think it should apply here.
Yeah, I think it. So the company I talked about previously, the management decided that we need to use contractors here to be able to grow and shrink the team. And it's hard to hire permanent people for whatever reason. So they made a decision at the management level that we need flexibility here. But ideally, it should be at the team level, that the people doing the work, having some control over how they work, that usually results, not always, usually results in the best outcomes and the best culture.
Right. It's coming up to 8 o'clock, so I'd like everybody to unmute their microphones and give Nick a great round of applause. We can hang on for further questions after that.
Thank you very much.
That's been a quite unique view on how to deal with teams, and it's kind of interesting take on.
Mediebransjen får krisepakke på 300 millioner kroner fra regjeringa. Har tatt store annonseinntekter under koronakrisa. Rusavhengige er de som sliter mest i denne tiden.
Right. Sorry, I was saying it's an interesting illustration of Conway's law, isn't it? Which was observed right back in the 1970s, that system architecture tends to follow team structures, and we've now seen a rationale for that, and actually encouraging it. Just before everybody goes, I'd like to point out that each time we have one of these talks, we'd like to show our appreciation of the speaker by giving them a book from the BCS library, and Nick has chosen this one. So can everybody see that? Mastering Digital Business. How powerful combinations of disruptive technologies are enabling the next wave of digital transformation. This is one of 60-odd titles in the BCS library, and it's worth looking through. They're all written by recent practitioners, and they're pretty hands-on. I like them. The one I chose when it was my turn was software testing. Okay, now we've got a few questions left on the list, so if people still want to hang on and ask those questions, please feel free to do so now. Hello? I think we had a question from Joe Stead. Sorry, I muted everybody because there was so much noise in the background. We had a question from Joe Stead. Can you see the micro team format with rotating members working with teams who are under time pressure, say at a startup? Nick, we weren't hearing you because the microphone was muted.
Yeah. Took me a while to work out how to unmute myself there. Sorry for that. To answer Joe's question, I would probably say no. In a high pressure environment, don't do things that are likely to increase the pressure, would be my feeling there, would be my gut instincts. Like the rotation thing usually takes a while to settle in. And some people probably won't like it. So it's best to do that when you have the time. I would say try it with a couple of teams first. Try and get a feeling from the people if they want to do this. And unless they think it's an advantage to get the work done while they're under pressure, I would probably avoid it in that situation.
Yeah. Well, the smallest micro team is 2 people, isn't it? So in the situation where I'm working at the moment, we continually promiscuously pair with each other, and that's a way of rotating team members around a larger team.
Yeah.
Can I just make a remark?
Please.
Sure.
Yeah, just on the micro teams and team rotations, team topologies talks about that, and in general, your organization needs to have maturity on their engineering cultures. So if you try to do that in, say, in a very new company or on an organization that has no engineering maturity, so the not good practice, etc., that tends to be to lead to say more messy situations than bringing advantages. So just a remark.
Yeah, I think that would, as a general rule to watch out for, that would probably make sense. The companies I've seen it in have typically been already quite mature in their ways of working. You know, companies, I think all of them were doing pair programming, for example. So this collaborative way of coding, even mob programming, was part of their culture. You know, working with other people was just how they went about getting their work done, their values, and so rotation was less of a jump from where they were, I would say.
Exactly. So if you have like common practices, etc., so they basically you will have them on the team that you will move to. So you share say those basic practices, and then it's easy to do these rotations and have new teams.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's the only way. I think there are always exceptions. The company I mentioned earlier, Redgate Software, so they did something super interesting. They actually automated the accelerate metrics. So every team's CI pipeline automatically measures the number of deployments, deployment lead time, change failure rate, and so on. And one of their teams had some training from a mob programming expert. They started doing mob programming and their metrics improved. And other teams saw that and they asked them, oh, can you help us with mob programming? So people from the team who were doing well went to work with other teams and share those ideas. So if you've got one team who's working well, rotating people into other teams could also be another way of achieving this. But I would say Redgate Software is in terms of their engineering culture, is very mature, very professional. A lot of the good practices, they're pretty much doing everything good, I would say. Not perfect, but they're a mature company and it probably worked there. They weren't an example of a low performing company, that's for sure.
Yeah, thanks. Tom Gilb has said, thanks for introducing ideas and literature that are new to me. Hopefully we can find measures and case studies sooner or later to clarify the degree of utility. Failing to be evidence-based leads to things like Spotify methods being adapted even when they have failed to get enough benefit. I think being adopted. Yeah, so I answered cargo cult for that, yes.
Yeah, I think, the problem we all face is we go to companies or we work at companies, they've heard of something like test-driven development, continuous delivery, user stories.
Even Scrum.
And it's worked. And it's worked at some companies, and they think if they just start doing these things, they'll be successful. What would be fantastic is if we had research saying, if you apply this concept in this particular way, and you're working in this kind of company, you are 80% likely to be successful. Right now, we don't have that. We've just got arguments about what does the Agile Manifesto really mean? What's a user story? And people selling certifications, cult of personality. If someone's very vocal on Twitter, very passionate about an idea, people start to believe it's a good way of working. So yeah, I think that's why I like the Accelerate book. It's a step in the right direction for being a bit more evidence-based and a bit more scientific about how we work in software engineering.
Okay, great. I think that about puts the lid on it. So I'm going to terminate this recording now. Thank you everybody for coming, and do stay with us. Tom Gilb's workshop series commences again this coming Wednesday in a week's time and goes on for a further 3 weeks. So you're very welcome to attend that. And those workshops illustrate how you can be evidence-based and how you can measure value in all the activity that you do. So very interesting. Thank you, Nick. And do let us know where people can pick up the slides.
Awesome. Thank you for inviting me.
Good night.